checking out the Sonoff Basic R3 with the DIY mode. Is it really worth it? Let's see. So we have the regular R3 model plus the RF R3 model. The model numbers can get kind of confusing with the R3, then the RF, etc. But this is just the same type of switch. The only thing they've added is the RF side to it, so you get the little extra chip on the bottom, plus you do get the antenna for the 433 megahertz. We're not going to focus on the 433 megahertz control, since of course you can use MQTT or whatever with Wi-Fi to control these. So of course this is the original Sonoff Basic. Everyone's familiar with this, where we could solder in the 5 pins to get our power and the RX, TX, ground, and then GPIO 14. It made it really simple to add additional switches and motion sensors like we did with the Hydra Basic one, where we added 2 touch sensors plus a PIR motion sensor. Now, of course, the one downside we all have seen with the various pictures, of course, were the traces on the back weren't always soldered as good, and I usually would add a bit of solder to my traces to make sure I had enough solder on the back of mine when I put them in, say, the wall or different lamps, etc. So moving on, they did come out with the R2 version of the Sonoff Basic. They also did have the Sonoff Basic R2 RF, which added an antenna plus the little RF board that went in the middle. One big difference they made was they got rid of the traces on the back and went to some actual jumper wires that went across. One thing that threw a lot of people for a loop was they were now missing their GPIO 14 that they were used to put in their switches. So of course you can see there's only a 4-pin header, and this would going to be your voltage, RX, TX, and ground. You are now missing GPIO 14. Now you could attach to GPIO 2 on the back, but it was not a through hole, so it could be difficult for some to solder to. Plus, since it was GPIO 2, you could not hold this to ground during boot, otherwise it would not boot up. Now, of course, we could use GPIO 3 if we had a switch that could possibly be in ground at boot and still use the R2. Now you'll notice I don't have an LED on my board here because I've actually removed it, and I want to show you something at the end of the video for a little bonus segment on what I've done with this model. Now moving on to the R3. There was a lot of hype for the DIY mode, and supposedly you wouldn't need Tasmota and you could connect them to MQTT and several different components because it had DIY mode. It was going to remove the entire need for having to use third-party firmware. We'll see. So one big change you'll notice right off the bat, they went back to traces on the back. Now I didn't add any solder to this one. This is exactly how it came out of the package. Seems like a decent amount of solder. Now normally I just use a Sonoff Basic for LED lighting of some sort, which is a very small load considering what it's rated at for its 10 amp capacity. One big problem you'll see is there is a header with holes on the top, but it could be very difficult to solder because you can't get to the back of it very easily without unsoldering these pins here. And then there's another set in the middle right there. These 4 pins. I actually wouldn't even try it. So now what you can do to easily flash this, you can, like we've shown in many other, like the GoSun switches or the eTech City 3-way, you can just put in an empty header and hold it in there and flash it without any issue. Now you say, what about DIY mode? Well, to do DIY mode, what you need to do is you do have to open this up and you have to put a jumper on here to actually put it in DIY mode. Now the one problem I have with that is, well, if you have to open it up already, why don't you just flash it with your own firmware and not be locked into some supposed DIY mode that you have to jump through hoops and do a hotspot and attach it to it and use a special program, etc. When the headers are right here, just put the 4 wires in and flash it. It's just as simple as throwing the jumper on it. And that way you can throw your Tasmota that you're familiar with, or ESP Home, or ESPurna, or ESP Easy, etc. Just throw it on there and be done with it and call it a day. Now, one issue you will run into with this is you can use this pin for a switch with one of the GPIO pins, but you will not have an easy way to grab 3.3 volts unless you do solder a header to this board. So if you're trying to use a sensor like I2C or something like that, I would not recommend using this board. This is a difficult one to use. Plus you don't have these traces. I don't like these traces. So just to say what that is, if you ask what my favorite Sonoff is, we're going to go with the R2. The R3 in the DIY mode, I'm just going to give it a huge thumbs down. I really don't like this board. I didn't really like it from the jump whenever we saw the FCC documents. The hype of the DIY mode just doesn't make sense to me when you just want to flash it with your own firmware anyway, as it's much easier than dealing with the DIY mode. After all, it's only a few bucks for a USB flasher, and you just simply hold it on there and flash it with your computer. It's very simple to do, that anyone can do that, which is probably even easier than the DIY mode. Quick little comparison. I like the revision 2 the best. And you say, what about GPIO 14? Well, we're going to show you that in a second. Then the original, you just can't go wrong with the OG. And the revision 3, I wouldn't even bother. So let's do a cool little project with what I modified here by snipping off the LED on the R2. So if you've watched one of my older previous videos, the Sonoff R3 Basic, you've seen these little touch capacitive sensors, and I've used them in various projects for putting them behind blank face plates, and they work out great because it's just a little touch sensor and you can actually see the red LED, or they do have other colors that will go through a blank face plate on the wall. And of course then you can put the Sonoff Basic or Sonoff Dual, etc., whatever in the wall, and just put these on a blank face plate. And all you do is put this on the blank faceplate with some hot glue on it, and it keeps it through the faceplate and allows it to work. The one thing about these is they do hold low all the time when they're not being touched if you take them out of latching mode, like I've done with this one, where you solder the 2 points together, and this allows you to do a short and long press action on them for various other automations. Well, the one issue with that on the Sonoff Basic R2, even though this is our favorite one, you only have 2 readily available pins, and one of them being GPIO 1, you cannot use that with a switch that is held low anytime the device boots. Now you say, well, they do have GPIO 2 on the back. Well, GPIO 2 has that same issue. You cannot hold that low when the device boots up. And of course, what we've tried to do is do one with the Sonoff Basic and 2 of these capacitive touch sensors and a motion sensor. And I will leave the links for these in the description of the video, along with the link to the R3 Basic video if you haven't seen it. So one solution I've come up with that works out great is actually to snip the LED off of the board and use the LED pin as an input. So the real easy way to do that is we'll just use some jumper wires, and we'll attach the red on VCC. We will use the brown for ground, and we'll use the yellow for the signal. And then to wire it up on the Sonoff Basic R2, it's real simple. If you need the pin out, it is on the bottom for the ground, TX, RX, and 3.3 volts. 3.3 volts is closest towards the actual button, and the ground is the last pin. The 2 middle pins are RX and TX. And then the yellow, we'll just put that on the pin closest to the button with the DuPont jumper, and that like that, and it will still fit in the case. You do have to cut out a notch or something in top of the case to make the wires pass through. I don't like to make the wires pass through with the mains voltage if you are using this to actually switch mains off and on. So that's it for wiring up the little touch capacitive sensor. Let's go check it out in the Tasmota GUI. So in the Tasmota GUI for this Sonoff Basic, since we're not going to be using the standard setup with the LED and the relay and the button, etc., like you would normally see with a Sonoff Basic, we want to change this to a generic module, as you can see we've done here. Just go to Configure Module and make sure you set it to generic 18, and then you can go in and change all the various GPIO pins to match up what you want. Now we've gone ahead and configured this with the standard button 1 on GPIO 0. Of course, we're going to have relay 1 that's on GPIO 12. Now one difference you're going to see is the LED. We're using that as switch 2 with the N, meaning no pull up. With these capacitive touch buttons, you don't need to pull the sensor line high, since these do pull low when not being touched when you take off the latching mode. So I would recommend using the N for no pull-up. Now we don't have any rules applied here, so immediately, since there is no relay 2 on this device, as soon as we do touch the button, it should toggle the relay. So go back to the main menu. We've already saved that, and you'll notice when we do touch the button, and you will see the red LED on the capacitive touch, it does turn the relay on because we don't have any rules set up for or a relay 2 on a pin. Now you can see this is all working through the LED pin, and we're not using the RX or the TX pin on the Sonoff Basic, which you can use those for other sensors, or you could use some other capacitive touch, PIRs, etc. And if we did want to do a rule on this, we could just go to the console and do rule 1 on switch 2 state do publish. Let's call it Sonoff R2 button. You could call the topic whatever you like, and we'll put the value of whatever the switch state is in the payload for the MQTT message. So we should just, with one single touch, it should send a payload of 2. And there's the payload of 2. And then if we long press, we get the payload of 3. So we could use that to trigger some Node Red or various other Home Assistant automations. Or we could just use no rules at all if we were putting it into a wall box and wanted to use the capacitive touch sensor to toggle anything else. But keep in mind, you can use a couple of the capacitive touch buttons in your wall to do various other lights, and that would give you 2 short presses plus 2 long presses. And you could even use a motion sensor like we've shown in the Hydra Basic, and this is all done using the Sonoff Basic R2. So that's it. We just wanted to update you what we thought about the new Sonoff Basic R3. It's definitely, I have to say, it's definitely a thumbs down for this product. I'll stick with the OG Sonoff Basics or the R2, depending on which one I can get with the different stock inventories, which seems like a lot of people have been lately getting the R2 models when they've been ordering them on Amazon and various other sites. So Sonoff, if you are watching this, I do have to give you made a little try with the DIY mode, but it's not there yet. We shouldn't have to put a jumper on the inside. We should just be able to open up the app, and straight there from the app, we should be able to go in and flash our own firmware straight from the app. And that would be a true DIY mode where you could appeal to the masses that just want to put these in the cloud and just use the app. Plus us tinkerer DIY people, we could actually just also sync it up with the app, go into a different menu, hit yes I'm sure a couple times, and send over our own bin file straight from the app. And that would be a true DIY mode that everyone would love. So appreciate you watching, and y'all take care.